We could have filled 3 slides with background in Graham's experience and achievements, but on the slide today you can see the key highlights. We're delighted to have you here with us today, Graham, so we can learn from your insights and experience. And Rona, our HR Services Manager, will be hosting the conversation with Graham today. There'll be time, as always, for questions and feedback. We also welcome questions for Graham in the chat box, and I'll be keeping my eye on that throughout the hour. Over to you, Rona.
That's great. Thanks, Lindsay. So we wanted to introduce the topic just by speaking a little bit about the changing world of work. So you'll see on the screen a few points there that there's been such rapid change over the last few years, and that does have an impact on workplace culture, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So thinking about hybrid and remote working, flexible working, that's commonplace now. And that does impact how we build trust, team spirit, and our ability to address tensions as well, the way that we connect. There's new pressures as well, economic uncertainty. It's always been there, but it's really heightened at the moment. Workload pressures and job insecurity as well. And that can impact on how people show up in the workplace. Thinking about the blurred boundaries between work and home life with this new way of working. I know myself, I'm guilty of making sure that you switch off when you work from home. So actually switching down your laptop and not trying to juggle various different things between work and home life. Thinking about the news stories that are coming in regularly, there's such a focus on inclusion, diversity, psychological safety, and well-being. And it's not always, a focus on should we promote diversity. We're also seeing the other side at the moment. Should there be less focus? So there's a big debate on this. So this is changing how we actually interact in work. And change can surface stress, conflict, and harmful behaviours if they're not managed. So there's a big role for leadership there, and we'll be talking about that today. And so the title of our webinar, we're wanting to help share tips, insights on how we can create a culture of courage and care in your organisation, because that will support employees to manage all of these changes that are out there. So we know that workplace culture is important, but if we see harmful behaviours, we do find that hard to actually deal with. We know that it's logical to intervene on the basis of fairness, respect, and there's a legal requirement, and we've got our codes of conduct as well. But actually, it's really hard in the moment, and that's because we're humans. So we've got that natural human response that we don't like conflict, uncertainty, and we don't want to get things wrong either. But if we leave it unchecked, then it can spread and it creates poor conduct, which is more normalised, it erodes trust and safety, and it can damage team culture and performance as well. So wanted to put it out to the audience about, well, workplace culture. What does that actually mean to you, and why is it important? And then we'll be handing over to have a conversation with Graham to get his views as well. So if you can pop your thoughts into the chat box so we can see that before Graham then gives us his insights.
It's a really good question. I think, really getting people to think about what workplace culture actually is, isn't it? And I think a lot of organizations rely on PowerPoint slides or whatever, but it's really important that we start thinking about what it is.
Yeah, so let's see what we've got then. We've got values and behaviours that people demonstrate, the way that we do things around here. And that is something I think Dorothy mentioned that in one of our recent conversations. It's a great description that summarises it. We've got from McKinney HR, the stories people tell as well, interaction with each other, values, that's coming up again, the unspoken rules in an organisation, I like this one, the general vibe in the office. So it's got that feeling, isn't it? It links in with your emotions. The ways in which we interact with each other and values again. Yeah, so there's some common themes coming through there, but Graham, what's your view on it? What is workplace
Yeah.
culture and why does it matter?
I'm loving this sort of focus on values and attitudes. And, for me, culture is the weather system. It's or our sort of immune system for organizations. In the bad times, culture will help. Culture will really help people. But, that weather system, that collective values, attitudes, behaviors, beliefs that people really get behind. And I often talk a lot of my work about the All Blacks rugby team. They talk about Vanu, family, a sense of flow. The team that flows in the same direction will be the most successful. So I think it's really important that we start to think about it. You can't put your hands on it. You can't just pick it up and feel it. It's like when I work in different organizations, I get a sense of culture. How I'm treated when I walk into the building, how I see staff interacting with each other. So culture is that's my viewpoint in culture. And why is it so important? Because it affects absolutely everybody in the organization, alongside our clients, our service users, even families of staff. Are impacted. If you're going home from work at night and you don't feel good about your workplace, that'll impact on your family as well. And for me, it affects your staff on their way to work, how they feel. Are they excited about coming to your workplace, or are they dreading it? It affects them at the workspace as well, or it affects them when they go home. Are they upset about leaving workplace? That's a good sign. I've taken that too far, I know, but if they're really excited about their workplace, then I spent my last years in policing working with the violence reduction unit, and I loved it. The culture there was we looked out for each other. We just looked out for each other. We knew what we were wanting to achieve in our role, and we just helped each other out. So for me, it's really, really important culture. And I think sometimes leaders just rely on the PowerPoint slide, the slogan, and for me, it's an everyday occurrence.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And we spend so much time at work that, if the culture's impacting you, then that's a huge issue, isn't it? You mentioned about taking it home with you as well. And
Yeah.
it- we mentioned about the stress factor as well. And it's not just workload. Everybody goes automatically to, oh, they must be
Yeah.
doing too
And
much.
I think it also impacts on decision making. Like the big story just in the last couple of days, the police seemingly overreacting to that situation at the airport in Heathrow, and I have to agree with that. And I think what policing, I've talked about policing a few times today. I think a lot of leaders in policing have got that freeze response where I need to be seen to be doing something. Think about the last 4 or 5 years in policing, all the negative stories. And policing has really been under sort of behind the eight ball in the last few years. And I think it's reacting. Policing's lost its power to be just, to use discretion in certain cases as well. So I think culture will affect many things. It'll affect how we feel, but it'll affect how we make decisions. Someone mentioned psychological safety, being trusted to make decisions, and I think I'm seeing that being played out in some decisions in policing, in particular that one yesterday.
Yeah. Okay. And we've talked about the changing workplace then. So what's your view on the changes in the way that we work and interact, and how that affects how we build and sustain culture?
Yeah, I'm doing some work just now I work with US policing from time to time, helping US police and prisons as well build cultures, build good, safe cultures. And one thing we've been looking at recently is the different generations of people that we're leading that are coming into the workplace. I think just now, leaders and organizations, I suppose HR departments are managing 4 generations of individuals, the Gen X's and all these different individuals. And that old sort of saying, it's always been like this, that needs to change because all these people are bringing in great ideas, they're bringing in good motivations, good values, good attitudes. Just now, this generation now, the activist generation, they will be asking questions. They're curious about things. So I think being aware of that is really important. And you mentioned at the start this pushback against DEI. I think a lot of people are getting sucked into this idea that DEI is a bad thing. But relationships underpin absolutely everything. You know, I 30 years in policing taught me many things, but it was one, the power of community, and you are communities in your workplaces, so it's important we activate our communities. But also, it taught me the power of relationships. If we get relationships right in organizations and teams, then we flourish. You know, relationships are the currency of change. We need to really, really build on that. And I think we need to push back against this, push back against DI, because mental health, now more than ever, is being talked about. You know, and you talked in some of your slides about work, you know, burnout, fatigue, issues at home. It's a very scary world just now that people are living in. You know, I don't know about you, but 2 days ago I was dreading that press conference from the White House, thinking, what is he going to talk about today? It creates a stress response, right? And
Yeah.
I think we need to be mindful of that. It's not just about stress at work; it's about stress at home as well. And I think organisations often rely on, you know, employee assistance programs. And think about that for a minute. If you're relying on an EAP or employee assistance programs, they're important. But if you're relying on that to deal with mental health issues, you're basically passing your staff on to people. And I
Yeah.
think there's a stage well before that where we create cultures of just looking out for each other. You know, there's a neuroscientist in America, Bruce Perry, talks about therapeutic doses, right? And he just equates them to checking, you know, sort of checking in with people. How you doing? You know, that was a great bit of work you did yesterday. You know, when we start to really encourage these one-to-one conversations, we build community, we build social connections, and we help build a counterbalance against high stress, high workload, burnout, fatigue. So I think, you know, we need to push back against the pushback against DI, be more aware of the need to talk about well-being, because well-being is the backstory to mistakes in workplaces, and poor well-being doesn't excuse bad behavior, but it's a factor. So we need to focus on that a lot more.
Mm. So what I'm picking up from you, Graham, I'm thinking, you know, curiosity stood out there, that it's good to be curious.
Yeah.
Kindness as well, looking out for each other. You know, there's so much in there about just being nice to people, isn't it? You know,
It's,
just
it's,
looking out for each other, that community aspect that you talked about.
it's so obvious, isn't it? Well, I know a few years ago I watched some baseball teams in the US, and I've got my baseball in front of me just to remind me of the session. And Joe Madden, who was the manager of the Chicago Cubs, his mantra before we were doing some training around harassment and bullying and whatnot, because his viewpoint was that distractions off the field become distractions on the field. And his mantra that year was, "What you give, you get back, and more." And he turned that. I love that saying. He turned that into the word respect. When you give respect, respect comes back. When you show kindness, kindness comes back. And we know in toxic workplaces, people don't speak up. They keep their heads down. They acquiesce by bad behavior. But when you put the effort in to create a kind, respectful workplace, which actually most people want to work in, you just have great outcomes. People do speak up. They feel safe in speaking up. So yeah, I think that's important.
Yeah, and the curiosity side of things as well. I think, you know, we talk about, yeah, just be kind to each other, but actually, that can be really hard if you've got a lot going on that somebody doesn't know about. And so when people are acting in a certain way, if you're curious about,
Yeah.
okay, why are they acting like
Yeah.
that? That's
It's
really important.
it's really important, yeah, to think about that. You know, stress. You know, some stress is good for us human beings. You know, sort of low levels of stress that's short-lived it builds resilience. But see, when stress is prolonged, extreme, and unpredictable, it leads to dysregulation in human beings. And people sometimes overreact to even the mildest of sort of stimuli. So it's really important that I think we understand the stress that's out there. And you're right, don't go diving in. You know, I spent a lot of my time in policing pointing fingers at people rather than understanding where did the behavior come from.
Yeah.
So that idea when you're speaking to a colleague who might be behaving in a harmful way, inappropriate way, hey, listen, that isn't like you, Rona, right? I've worked with you for so long now. You know, this isn't like you. What you did was wrong, but come on, what's going on? It's that idea of connecting with the person before you correct them. That's a social work phrase that I learned from my wife. Connect before you correct. And you can apply that when you're speaking to a colleague who's maybe doing something wrong. Use your relationships. You know, use the relationships that you build in your workplace, and then you can still correct people. But you're doing it in a very less confrontational way. And a question for the audience today is, you know, don't put stuff in the report in the chat, But let's say, for example, you made a mistake. You said something that was wrong in your workplace. What would work in you? What would lead to you apologizing? And most of you would want, take me aside, just tell me, don't judge me, but just tell me. And that's going to likely lead to you apologizing to the person and you never behaving in that way again.
And then it's a learning opportunity as well, isn't it? So,
Yeah.
it's about similar to delivering feedback. In HR, we're thinking about performance and delivering feedback. It needs to be done in the right way.
Totally.
So you can give somebody feedback, it's then a learning situation. But we mentioned about, that takes, you've got to be a bit brave to do that, haven't you? So there are some reasons that people stay silent. And what's your perspective on that, Graham? We mentioned some in the slide before, but I'm interested in what you're thinking.
It's a question that we don't spend enough time on, and I want to spend a little bit of time on that. And I want to ask the audience. So before I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes or a minute or so, but I want people in the audience, what do you think is the biggest reason people don't or give for not speaking up? I want you to, and I call these inhibitors. What inhibitors bystander action, colleagues from doing the right thing? It's really important that we focus a lot on the psychology of inaction. Catherine Sanderson, my friend's a psychologist in the US, and she's taught me loads about this work. And she says, spend time helping people understand why they don't speak up. The first step to intervening is understanding why you don't intervene. Because when you know the reasons for not speaking up, then you can start to work and overcome them. Silence is not inevitable, right? We can use good quality training, good discussion to help, fear, the fear of not being supported. And the reality in workplaces is that you will likely be supported. In a workplace, you're going to meet people who I think they're called in the field actively toxic people. These are the people that come to work every day and do bad stuff, and they don't change. They're very unlikely going to change their mindset. They need to be reported. And very early in the work that I do, I break down this misperception of being unsupported. You will be supported for reporting that type of behavior. So we overcome the fear by having conversations, right? Lots of organizations rely on e-learning training or whatever to do this type of training. It's not enough because you don't break down what in psychology is called pluralistic ignorance, where you often wrongly perceive what your friends think. So when you invest in conversations with your staff and your team, you help break down these misperceptions. Fear is the big one. A lot of people are talking about the fear of backlash, the fear of being disloyal. In the work that I do, I often say to people, just now, you and your roles, you give your staff two choices when they witness harm. And choice one is to ignore it. I think, despite a code of ethics, there's still an option to ignore it and do nothing. It's not a great option because you could find yourself being investigated for not intervening in a situation. Two is to report it as per your code of ethics. And we know that people who do speak up are often referred to in a negative way, the whistleblower, the grass, the snitch. So the work that I do is trying to help people intervene before they need to report it. Not everything's reportable. If we act early in the moment, we don't have to run the risk of being called a grass or a snitch. And I think the word loyalty is a big thing in all organizations. And just redefine loyalty. Loyalty for me is critical loyalty. The courage, the moral courage to tell a friend what they need to hear, not what they want to hear. The campaign in the US in the 1980s, Friends Don't Let Friends Drive Drunk, led to so many people taking car keys off their friends. So let's use that. Friends don't let friends lose their careers, but help your staff intervene in these early moments. And when you do that, you'll actually have more reports. People will feel safer in reporting because they're actually reporting the right people. And Tina talked about scared of the outcome. Sometimes, just now in my old profession in policing, officers are rightly losing their jobs in some cases, but sometimes people are losing their jobs for things that 2 years ago they wouldn't be losing their jobs for. And nobody in policing wants to be seen as the person who lost so-and-so their job. And that, I think, came from the NHS report recently where people, the overreaction from managers led to people not wanting to speak up. Joan talks about someone else will do that. You know, the fear of that sort of reliance on other people. Yeah, that's called the bystander effect. The more people present, the less likely people will intervene. So again, have conversations, help people take responsibility. See if you see something harmful in your workplace, say in your head, I'm going to deal with this, right? Just take responsibility. You don't have to deal with it there and then. You could just leave it till tomorrow or the next day, but take responsibility. It's the first step in change. Confidence. Confidence, someone mentioned confidence. Confidence comes from knowing what to do, what to say, but confidence also comes from, and someone mentioned being unsupported. So create that supportive environment. And as I say often, silence doesn't isn't it doesn't have to be inevitable. It can be overcome, but how you create these conversations in workplaces will go a long way to helping your staff and you, I suppose, as well, from overcoming all these fears and reasons. And let's not forget one more as well that is prevalent in lots of organizations, and that's hierarchy. You know, hierarchy, whether it be formal, the boss, or informal, age, role, experience. And the simple thing that you can do is, as line managers, is give your staff permission to come and speak to you and do it every day, right? It's part of your work. You know, it's called, I call it affirming trust. I trust you. If I make a mistake, I want you to tell me. I want you to do it. And you can have these conversations in your workplace quite easily, actually.
There's a lot in that, Graham. So, you know, just to summarize for ourselves, so thinking as individuals, then making the decision to actually take responsibility, starting with that, and then thinking about how you can make yourself more confident. So there's a bit of preparation in that as well, isn't there? Thinking about what you could say, how you could do it, how
Yeah.
it'll land, because the how is really important, isn't it? You've got to speak up, but do it in a way that's going to be effective, and that will reduce the risk of being judged and unsupported.
Just to bring that point there, it's a really good point there. You know, when you're stressed, you're less intelligent. The psychology backs that up. When you're stressed, you're less smart because your brain is driving this, the fight or flight response. And in aviation, they call it caging the gorilla. Train yourself to step back. You know, there's this idea that to be an active bystander doing something, you need to step in. You don't. You could do it tomorrow, but you could do something at the time. You could distract, disrupt. You could just leave it until after the meeting. But you know, if you dive into situations, you might get it wrong. You might overreact to the situation. So you know, I urge everybody, be selfish. Be selfish in these early moments before you, because that gives you time to think. What am I going to say to this person? How am I going to have the conversation?
Yeah. And you mentioned line managers, leaders as well have a role to play. So what do you see as their role in encouraging or discouraging people to speak up?
You know, leadership leaders are the architects of culture. And I think we in many organizations, leaders now are focused too much on the task of the job getting done at the expense of the culture. And I think leaders nowadays, especially in policing, I think really need to move away from just task orientated to culture building, where you start to really role model these behaviors. So that, you know, role modeling, good leaders are good role models. We need more emotional intelligence, I think. You know, emotional intelligence is often seen as the soft skill. To me, it's a requirement now for all all leaders in organizations. And I think a message that I try and give leaders as well. Remember that day when you came in the door, when you joined the organization, how difficult would it be back then to speak up and address situations? So really think about these things. You know, also reward action. When if you see it, you know, it's a good thing. You're thanking people for doing that. And you know, I think leaders invest. You know, we talked in that first question that your culture is worth so much to you. And a question I ask in a lot of my work is when we don't see people speaking up, who or what is harmed? And yeah, victims are harmed, bystanders, because bystanders lead, you know, moral injury is a big issue in workplaces, not speaking up, and you feel you internalize that. The people who cause harm are harmed because not everybody needs to lose their jobs if we act early. If we don't, they could lose their jobs. But your business is harmed, your reputation. You know, look at policing in the last few years, you know, payouts for compensation. You know, there's some councils in Scotland who have set aside £1 million budgets for compensation funds for past abuse scandals. You know, where could that money be getting spent? That's taxpayers' money that is being rightly so given to people who have been harmed in the past. So, you know, really think about why this is really important to you as well, but also ultimately your staff will perform better. Your staff deserve a safe, supportive workplace, and it starts with you. And if you get it right, you create more leaders. You know, leadership for me is not just about the role. You know, for you to reach out to a colleague and acknowledge they've been a victim of bullying, that was wrong and not your fault. You're being a leader. You're showing compassion and empathy. For you to reach out to a colleague who's behaving inappropriately, you're showing moral courage. So if leaders create these cultures, then leaders create leaders. And they take over. They really start to build the culture that you want to see in your organization.
Yeah, so build the culture by role modeling the behaviours that will help to create that safe space, that culture of care. Okay, so you mentioned active bystandership before.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can just cover
Yeah.
that a little bit more and how it can shape a culture.
Yeah. That phrase active bystandership is quite a slippery term, isn't it? People watching this today will be thinking a number of things. They'll be thinking that doesn't make sense. It's very oxymoronic. How can you be an active bystander? Because the dictionary definition of bystander is passive, doing nothing, standing by watching. And here's Graham putting active in front of it. And it doesn't make sense. So we need to, when I do the training with organizations, I start, what does active bystandership mean to you? So just to clarify, and by the way, this isn't my idea, right? I'm not here today to claim to be the inventor of active bystandership. 50, 60 years of research confirms that we can train people to be more active. So active bystandership is the art and science of reducing harm. And a lot of people associate harm with just bad behavior, but other harms take place in organizations. I've talked about well-being. Well-being can lead to mistakes. So there's another harm. Aviation introduced this style of training in the 1980s to reduce mistakes in cockpits, which would be fatal for everybody in the plane. Similar in parts of the US, they use this training in operating theatres, emergency rooms, to deal with medical errors. A scary thing that I've read in NHS England in the last couple of years, 11,000 people walk into hospital and don't come out again.
Wow.
And when they looked at the main factors, two main factors, toxic cultures and hierarchies were present. That consultant is king type mentality. And we've seen some issues in Scotland in the NHS around maternity wings, wrongly prescribing drugs or whatever. That's impacting on people we care about. So it's really important we start to think about that. So harm is bad behavior, harm from well-being, and harm from mistakes. They're all connected as far as I'm concerned. And third parties, friends, colleagues, strangers, they see things. This science. So this science is 50, 60 years old. There's so many social science experiments out there, which I bring into the trainings, which really start to clarify why people don't intervene in situations. Your staff are busy just now. There's good science that says that when you're busy, you become task focused, you miss things. So let's talk about the science. When you start to bring the science into the room, people start to, oh, I didn't realize that. Oh, that's obvious. Now they can think about it. And Joan talked about group size. There's the bystander effect from 1968 looked at groups and people not intervening in situations. Hierarchies. The Milgram experiment, the electrocution experiment, looked at looked at the Nuremberg trials. I was following orders after the Second World War II with the Nazis. And we can use these experiments to really switch people on to why people are not intervening in situations. So active bystandership is not about being the hero. Let's just clarify this. It's not about being the hero. It's about doing the right thing early on in the moment. The right thing for your colleague, for you as well, but also your profession. It's about doing the right thing to help another person, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, so we definitely know now we want to intervene early. We want to take action. We want to be brave. We want to build our confidence with doing that. We've talked about, the impact on individual well-being and team dynamics. We've mentioned stress quite early on. Is there anything you want to add to that, Graham, about how speaking up or staying silent impacts individual well-being and team dynamics?
Well, let's go back to that question I asked a little while ago. When we don't see active bystanders, who or what is harmed? So let's focus on victims. If you're a victim of bullying, harassment in the workplace and nobody's helping you, you're isolated, you're alone, you are thinking, is it my fault? You're thinking, what's coming next? Is it just me? There's a mental health crisis right there as well. So when people are not being supported in workplaces, then that will impact on a mental health crisis on the victim of harm. I think also as well, I talked a little while ago about moral injury. Moral injury is that idea where if you don't live up to your values, you don't do the right thing. I didn't help a colleague of mine in the 1980s in my team in Edinburgh, and he was being bullied at work, and I just put my head in the sand, thinking to myself, it's not my business, it's not me. What's it got to do with me? I was like 19 years old, a few weeks in the door in policing, and to this day I still regret not saying things to Craig, my colleague. Right? There's things now that I would say, hey mate, this is wrong or not your fault. You don't deserve this. Some simple things that you can all say to a victim or a friend or a colleague, but I didn't say that. And I think when we don't create cultures of active bystandership in action, then we're exposing our work staff to this moral injury, which will impact on their mental health and well-being, performance, retention. There's good research just now coming out from the US about policing, and I'm sure this will go across the board to lots of organisations where they're seeing a lack of retention of staff. It's not so much the high workload, it's the culture. Police officers don't leave the job. They join policing to help people. It's the culture that they're leaving. It's the unsupportive culture. And these are the uncomfortable conversations that I don't think some organisations are having, because culture is leading to people leaving organisations. So let's flip it. So when you do speak up, right, it's good for you. There's good chemicals are released in your body. So when you do intervene, when you do the right thing for your friend, your colleague, your organisation, or your communities or whatever, I think it's that idea of, is it oxytocin? Your body produces oxytocin. It's good for you. It's good for you. It makes you feel, it makes you feel good about yourself. But see, also, you help the victim. The victim gets a rush of oxytocin. This person cares about me. And other research says that if I witness you being kind to Dorothy, I get a boost of oxytocin. It inspires me to do the right thing. So that's a good thing. So when we start to see cultures where people speak up, stepping up, then people, and it working, people think, I could do that. That was quite straightforward. So they follow. It's that idea, what you promote, you permit. And organizations just need to, introduce these conversations into their training alongside the other culture work they're doing. I'm not here today to say that active bystandership will be the magic solution to all your issues. It's part of it. It's part of it, a big part for me.
Okay, excellent. Now, just thinking about time, because the big question for us all here today is, well, okay, we know what we need to do. How do we do it? And what are the first steps that we can take to actually start creating that culture of courage and care? And you've alluded to some there, Graham, but if you can think both at the employee level and the organisation level. Yeah.
First of all, see the benefits, right? See the benefits of creating these types of cultures, right? Because that is a big influencer for any human being, any organization. I think it's called reciprocity. When I do this work, I focus a lot on what's in it for me. So what's in it for me as an individual? What's in it for me as an organization? So for me, another thing that organizations, so let's start with the organization, needs to do is see the benefits, but also don't rely on your code of ethics. Right? Your code of conduct, your code of ethics is not a toolkit, right? And it's very clear from so many stories that people aren't speaking up. Think of the Greg Wallace story in the BBC recently, where we learn from temp staff where they feared their job loss. They didn't speak up. So despite having a code of ethics and all the past issues in the BBC, So excuse me, to realize that your code of ethics is not enough. Invest in conversations, right? Invest in relationships. We talked about that at the start. So don't rely on e-learning training, which I know is cheaper and is quicker to do. And you might have a big organization, but invest in conversational trainings. Don't feel you have to do things so quickly as well. A lot of organizations rush to do this work. Prevention is like a dripping tap over a glass. Eventually the glass fills up and it overflows. So just start and do it. Be consistent in your approach to do it. These conversations that you create will also, not only do bystanders need tools, but they need permission to act. And when you create these conversations, you start to help staff in your organizations see that people alongside them think as they do. So that gives permission. It's especially true for men. Big conversations just now on, men's violence against women and girls, sexual violence, sexual harassment. And, I spend a lot of time just now engaging men in this conversation. And a lot of the work that I do is about just helping them see what other men think or feel. And the majority of us guys are really upset when we hear a friend or colleague behaving inappropriately. But if we don't know what our friends around us think or feel, then there's a good chance we'll be silent. Some might even join in with the conversation. So invest in these face-to-face conversations. Just break down these misperceptions that exist as well. Top down, bottom up. This isn't just for your staff. This is for you as well. Leaders often, I look at policing. I'm referring to policing, but I look at other organisations. The number of chief executives or other senior leaders who are falling foul of not reporting things. So leaders are human beings too. So you need some sort of specific training as well to help you. But also when you sit in the rooms with your staff, you create that as one. That's the name of the program I run, As One Together, coming together to really, recognize it's hard. It's bloody hard to speak up. So let's talk about it together as well. So culture's top down, but it's also ground up as well. For staff, for people here today, how do we create cultures? You're important as well. You talk about stuff that you're passionate about. If you feel strongly about, I don't know, what's happening in the Middle East just now, talk about it. You will have victims of hate crime in your teams and organizations. If you feel strongly about domestic abuse, sexual violence, talk about it in a positive way, because you will have victims and survivors of abuse. So when you talk about it, you become an ally for people around you. I talk a lot about well-being. I lost my dad to suicide in 2008. Before that day, I never talked about it. But now, try and shut me up. I've got to make it okay for people around me to open up as well. You talked at the start about role modeling kindness and respect. That's simple. Just be yourself. Be kind, respectful, and do it every single day. If you see something happening in the workplace, learn to probe. If you're not sure what's going on, if it's ambiguous, there's another reason people don't intervene. They're not sure exactly what's going on. So just probe. Hey, you okay? If you're not sure someone's struggling, hey, are you okay? If they don't respond well to that, escalate it to, hey, are you okay? I've noticed. There's a tool I use from aviation, which is an escalation approach to intervening. And it's a really good tool for dealing with ambiguous situations in hierarchy as well. Another thing that we can all do better is revert to your moral compass, right? Your moral compass is your big, powerful motivator. Your presence is your superpower. It's been found in research to be the biggest motivator, right? And people with a greater sense of morality, moral compass and values are more likely to intervene. So organizations, don't impose your values on your people. Align your values with what your people believe in. Because I think most people have got good values. Policing within week one creates an army of clones. It's hard to go against the family in policing because we impose our values on people and we fail to acknowledge that most people who come into big organizations are good people. So have confidence in your staff as well. Learn to put yourself in the shoes of other people. Empathy is a big motivator for people as well. And lastly, embrace this stuff. Don't just see it as a quick fix. It's got to be a long-term commitment to culture. And culture, we said right at the start, is a consistent long-term approach.
Yeah, excellent. That's so good, Graham. And We've talked quite a lot about large organisations, and I'm just wondering if we can put another question to you there. We'll open up for the audience questions shortly, but what about a small team environment? Because that's when people are turning up to see each other face to face in a small, close-knit team. If there's some harmful behaviours in there, it can be really scary to be the person that speaks up in that situation. And all of what you've said is really good advice.
Yeah.
Have you got anything else for
Yeah.
that particular situation? Because we might have a few people in the audience who work in small teams where it's all even more intense.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not naive and stupid enough to think that this will work all the time, right? You know, it's like when I work with police officers in the US, you know, I often get the pushback, this won't work. And my response now to them, see that bulletproof vest you wear every single day? Will that stop every single bullet? No, it won't. Well, why wear it then? Right? All active bystandership is providing is another tool for organizations to use. But also when you build these conversations, I love going into organizations and not just the sort of scattergun. I like to work with teams, right? Bringing teams together. You know, I worked with West Yorkshire Police a few years ago, and some of the feedback I got was I like being with my team talking about this stuff. Because when you talk about this stuff, what you do is you break down these misperceptions that exist. Of course, there'll be people on your team who are not coachable, right? There are people out there who will not respond well to an intervention. So when I do the training with teams, that's why I focus a lot on what would work in you, because in a culture of active bystandership, there's a good chance that I'm going to tap you, that I could be tapped on my shoulder, something I've done. So I need to prepare myself for that. What's going to work in me? But if it doesn't work, then you use another tool, and that may be to report to your HR department. Or if I don't think I can speak to you, Ron, I might go and speak to Dorothy, because Dorothy knows you better than me. So tools give us the opportunities to overcome lots of these little challenges. You know, don't feel you have to intervene there and then. If you don't want to do it there and then, don't. And Chantal has a good point as well. Anonymous reporting is important as well. That gets poo-hooed sometimes by organisations, but it's yet another tool. The more tools you have, the more efficacy you give your staff, the more motivated they'll feel to intervene.
That's fantastic, Graham. Thank you so much. So, and now, hopefully, if I can get the technology right, I'm going to pop the presentation back up, and we've got a QR code which is for feedback for Graham. So it's really important that we can put that up. But in the meantime, while we're going through the feedback slide, if you can have a think about any questions that you would like to ask in the last 10 minutes as well. So
can I add in an example of something that happened where we had, and this is some years ago, we got asked to do a grievance, and it was an individual had put a grievance in against a director, and the director was due to retire in about 3 weeks. And everybody, you know, when I spoke to folk about, well, how did this all happen? And how could she possibly put in a grievance against a director who was leaving? Just let it go. And it turned out when we asked a bit more information, that director never walked into the main office to say hello to anyone, never asked folk how they were doing, never said, that was great, how you getting on? You know, and you can just imagine this over a period of time, that this person was bubbling inside, they needed that director to know how they felt before they left. And that's back to what Graham said earlier. It's about having conversations. If you're not prepared to ask your staff, how are they doing, speak to folk, then they're not going to speak to you. It's about role modeling. You can talk to me about anything, and they will, or you hope they will.
Yeah, there's a comment there from Teacher Jensen. You use the word challenge. You know, in a culture of active bystandership, intervening is not challenging your colleague; it's supporting them. It's just flipping how you look at this. You know, a lot of you will have heard the phrase calling people out. I use the phrase calling people in. Of course, some people need to be called out. There's no doubt about it. But calling out is confrontational. It's in public. Calling in is just taking a person aside, having a hey, I'm your friend. That connect before correct. type mindset. You know, you already have to challenge colleagues in most organizations. If they're breaching a code of ethics, you already have to do that. So do it early. You don't have to report things, and it can be done very, very supportive as well.
Graham, there's a comment there about your escalation tool that you mentioned, and while you were talking about that, I was thinking I'd be interested in that as well. I don't know if that's something that you could share with us, we can put out, because obviously we put out information after the webinar. So Chantal's mentioned she's interested in that too.
Yeah. It's that idea, you know, if you're not sure what's going on, like aviation, you know, if my captain's flying towards that storm cloud, right? I can see the storm cloud. And what aviation, they didn't want they didn't want junior staff to be always challenging the captain because it would get very confrontational. So they trained them to ask probing questions. You know, I train door staff in Scotland from time to time to, you know, and they deal with ambiguity all the time. You know, you're outside a bar club, you see a male leading a female from the bar. She's drunk, he's not as drunk. And this isn't right, but who could this guy could be the husband? I don't want to go in there all guns blazing. So, hey, how's your night going? Probing question. And that will either, your red flags will disappear or they'll increase. And if they increase, then you're going to escalate it to, you know, just to try and clarify some more before you take action. If it's very clear something's not right, and you know, if my captain's flying towards the cliff, that's getting closer and closer, I'm not probing, I'm going straight to take control of the plane. So if it's really obvious, take charge, but in these early moments, learn to probe. You know, it's a really good way for dealing with hierarchy, but also dealing with it's called the perils of ambiguity, just not knowing what's going on. And it's something we come across all the time as human beings.
That's great. Thanks, Graham. So we do have a really good question actually for someone who's early in their careers and dealing with seniority. So we've said you need to be brave to speak up and intervene sometimes, but it's even harder for someone who's early in their career, and then there's that power element. So have you got any advice there?
I said a few times, you don't, you know, in any situation in a workplace, you're going to come across bystanders, victims, and harm doers, the people who cause harm. And if you're a bystander and you see a colleague being bullied by, say, the senior leader, at the very least, I want you to speak to the victim. Hey, I saw what happened to you. That was wrong. That wasn't your fault. Victims deserve that. Okay. But I understand that it might be the partner in the law firm, it might be the line manager. You know what? I'm going to find somebody else to do that. You know, research says that when you focus responsibility on somebody else, they're going to do it. So maybe I might say, you know, I don't feel I can approach Dorothy, but I've seen Chantel having coffee with Dorothy. You know, find somebody who you think's closer than you are to the person. It could be another line manager, or it ultimately might be HR or an anonymous reporting helpline, right? It's little things like that. But one thing I've learned about this work is that victims deserve. And if all you do is speak to a victim, that was wrong and not your fault, I'm quite happy with that. You've done something. You've done something. And as I said before, positive evolution starts with small actions. And just reaching out to a victim is so powerful. You know, imagine if you were having a bad day at work and someone came up to you and said, that was wrong and not your fault. You start to help, don't you? You start to help. So really, don't think you have to go diving in that most senior organization, find somebody else who might be a bit more advanced in service than you are. Can they have a conversation? Tell them what you've seen, tell them what you want them to do, and they'll go and do it. But you've also got official reporting as well if you need to do that.
That's great, thanks. Now, Lindsay, have you had a look through the chat box? Is there any other questions that we've not addressed at this point?
Sorry, I'm going all the way back to the start. There's lots of them. There's so many different things. If anybody, what I would suggest is if Graham hasn't answered any of yours, then have this now to ask.
Yeah. Chantel's put something about, you know, if a calling in is not appropriate. Of course, if someone comes out with racism or misogyny, that's a code of conduct. You're going to have to report that. That's it. Or do something with that. You know, calling, as I said before, I'm not saying this will work all the times, and it might not be relevant. You know, what's reportable before training is still reportable after training. That doesn't change in this work.
And it's a good point about reporting. So Jeremy's put a comment in about what happens to workplace culture if there's too much reporting. You know, that can have a negative impact. And if people are starting to worry about being reported against, you know, and it being escalated too much. So that again talks about the advantage of intervening early and trying to nip things in the bud before it gets to that formal reporting stage.
Earliest is best. Earliest is best. But better late than never, I suppose.
Yeah, excellent. So hopefully you've all managed to use the feedback form QR code. I'm just checking our time. We've got a couple of minutes left. If anyone has any other comments, even if you want to add some examples that you would like to discuss, that's absolutely fine. We've got a question coming here. How do you balance confidentiality with offering examples of wrongdoing in a small team? So I'm sure, Graham, you've got multiple examples in your mind. So
it's a hard one. That's a hard one. That because obviously you don't want to be starting to, like, I use a lot of case studies in my work, and I'm always mindful about making sure we can't identify people with that as well. So for me, it's very hard to do that, to be able to keep certain things totally anonymous. It's a hard one, that one. And sometimes I'd like to know a bit more about what actually do you mean with that, and give me an example of that. But it is a hard one to think about how you would deal with that. Maybe that's some HR responses there.
yeah, in a small team, that's really tough. But I think you could approach it from, you know, bringing in this topic in general.
Yeah.
And just talking about behaviour and relationships and communication, and that's the backbone of everything. So, you know, how specific do you need to be with examples then if you're going in at that high level and talking about just being kind to each other? And you could talk about the positive examples instead.
And that's another way of balancing it is, you know, there's so much going on the news just now. You can actually relate, you know, talk about issues outside work that can be connected to it. That, you know, I remember years ago being approached by a guy who's his best friend. He'd been told that his friend was being quite coercively controlling in a relationship by his wife. His wife had reached out to the friend's wife, and he said, "How can I deal with this?" And I said, "Okay, tell me about his behaviour as a friend to you." Oh, he controls everything. Right, there you go. There's your in. There's your into this situation. Whilst allowing your own wife to deal with the victim here. You know, talk about that as a way there.
I think the thing to watch out with a small team is, and we sometimes see it, where the manager or team leader directly goes to a person and said, "Oh, somebody's told me that you've done XYZ, but I can't tell you who it is." And that just is, you know, that produces conflict. That's the wrong way to pick up anything like that. And we see that in investigations, and we see it in mediations, where the team leader contributes to the conflict by handling things badly.
Yeah.
Well, Graham, that's 1 o'clock already. You know, we could
go
on here for ages, but thank you so much to everybody as well. It's been so interactive today. So yeah, thanks for giving us your time, Graham, and your insights, and also to the audience for all the comments that have come through. It's been a great session.
Yeah, thanks very much, team, and all the best. And I think you've shared my contact details in the chat, so feel free to reach out, folks.
And
Thanks,
we'll close
Graham.
the webinar there. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, folks. Take care.